Late morning, August 24th, 1217, St. Bartholomew's Day. The Goodwin Sands lie 10 miles long off the Kent coast, and the wind is from the northeast, fresh enough to put white on the swell. A French great ship, the largest of a relief fleet bound for London, is sitting low in the water, so low that the waves are already spilling over her gunwales. She carries knights, war chests, and a trebuchet meant to break the walls of London for the man who has claimed the English throne. She is also carrying her Admiral. He is somewhere below, in the dark of the bilge, wedged between the ballast stones and the planking, while the deck above him goes silent. The English have boarded. The fighting is over. A Cinque Port sailor with an axe finds the trapdoor. 2 men reach down into the wet, salt-stinking dark and drag the Admiral out by the hem of his cloak. He stands on his own deck, ballast slime on his clothes. He is around 47 years old. He has commanded the Channel for the Kings of England and France for 12 years. He knows almost everyone in the boarding party by name. He offers 10,000 marks for his life. The offer is refused. This is the last hour of Eustace the monk. This is Black Ensign. The real history of piracy, told from what the records actually say. 3 things make sense of a Benedictine monk hiding in the bilge of a French invasion ship off the Kent coast in 1217. You need them all in your head at once. The man, the count, and the war. First, the man. Eustace was born around 1170 in the Boulonnais, the small county of chalk cliffs and salt pans that sits on the French side of the Channel, between the Canche River and Calais. His father, Baudouin Busquet, was a knight of the Boulogne nobility. Minor, not great. Hardy enough to have his own champion in a judicial duel. Not hardy enough to win it. When Eustace was a young man, his father was murdered. The matter went to trial by combat in front of the Count of Boulogne. The Busquet champion lost, and the killing was vindicated in court. There was no appeal. Eustace at this point was a black monk, a Benedictine, at the Abbey of Saint Wulmer at Samer, 15 kilometers inland from Boulogne. He left the cloister around 1190, took the feud back into his own hands, and went into the world as a layman with a grudge. The nickname stuck for the rest of his life. In English Chancery Latin, he is Eustachius Monachus. In French, Eustache Le Moyne. The monk. Second, the count. By the early 1200s, the Boulonnais belonged to a man named Renaud de Damartin. Renaud will become one of the great betrayers of the age. In 19 years, he will swear loyalty to Philip Augustus of France, then to John of England, then back to France, then to England again, and he will die in a French prison after the Battle of Bouvines. Around 1202, Eustace entered Renaud's service as seneschal. The seneschal was the count's chief steward. He held the books, took the rents, ran the household. It was a position of trust, with money on it. By 1204, Eustace was accused of financial malfeasance, embezzlement, failure to render proper accounts. He fled before he could answer. Renaud declared him outlaw, confiscated his lands, and burned his properties. Eustace went into the forests of the Boulonnais as an outlaw. Within a year, he was on Channel water, captaining ships. Third, the war. The political weather of the early 1200s, the weather Eustace lived inside, was the long collapse of the Angevin Empire. King John of England had lost Normandy in 1204. The Channel was now a frontier. Both kings, Philip Augustus of France and John of England, needed fighting captains who knew the ports of the other side. Eustace knew them all. By 1205, he was in John's pay. King John gave him a base in the Channel Islands, principally the small cliff island of Sark, and from Sark Eustace ran an English licensed pirate operation against French shipping for 7 years. Then in 1212, Renaud de Damartin defected from France to England, and the man Eustace hated most in the world was suddenly drinking wine in John's court. Eustace walked out of John's pay and into the service of Philip Augustus of France. By 1216, he was running French troops across the Channel for the invasion of England. By the morning of August 24, 1217, he was the admiral of a French relief fleet that, if it reached London, would keep a French prince on the English throne. This is what was at stake on the deck of his flagship when the Cinque Port sailor with the axe found the trapdoor. Over the next 20 minutes, I am going to show you 3 things. How a runaway monk became the most valuable mariner of his generation, paid by both kings of the Channel. Why the man who taught medieval England how to fight at sea has no statue and no grave. And why one specific tactical decision made off the Goodwin Sands by an English regent's fleet is the moment naval combat in northern Europe stopped being a land battle conducted on water. We will read from Matthew Paris, from Roger of Wendover, from the Anonymous of Bethune, from the verse romance written within decades of his death, and from the English patent rolls that paid him. Before we go any further, if this is your kind of history, told from the records rather than the legend, subscribe. A new ensign goes up every week. Now. Back to the Boulonnais, and a young monk who has just walked out of his abbey. The cloister at Samer in 1190 would have been a cluster of stone buildings around a Romanesque church set in beech woods, with a fish pond, a herb garden, and the working noise of a Benedictine house. Roughly 50 monks. The hours sung from prime to compline. A library, copying desks, a granary, a brewhouse, the smell of yeast and hot wax. Eustace walked out of that. The romance written about him a generation later, 2,300 lines of old French verse preserved in a single manuscript in Paris, opens with a long fictional excursion claiming he studied black magic in the schools of Toledo. He did not. Toledo was the medieval imagination's standard venue for forbidden Arabic learning. The same charge attaches to Pope Sylvester II. The Toledo material is a literary topos, and modern editors, principally Glyn Burgess in his 1997 critical edition, treat it as fiction. What Eustace actually did was return to the Boulonnais, prosecute the family feud through the courts of his lord the Count of Boulogne, lose, and enter Renault's service as seneschal. Then came the falling out. By 1204, Eustace was an outlaw in his own country, hiding in the forest of Hardelot. The romance lavishes its best material on this period. Eustace disguises himself as a charcoal burner with a blackened face and walks through the Count's hunt without being recognized. He disguises himself as a pilgrim, as a potter, as a shepherd. He even, in one episode, disguises himself as a woman to spy on Renault's hall. The historian Maurice Keene, in his 1961 study, The Outlaws of Medieval Legend, places Eustace in the direct genealogy of the early Robin Hood ballads. The toolkit of disguise, forest hiding, and the humiliation of an aristocratic enemy is identical. How much of this actually happened? Probably very little of the specific incidents. But the underlying period, roughly 1204 to 1205, when Eustace was a Boulonnais outlaw, is real because it explains what comes next. He went to sea. By 1205, Eustace was in the pay of King John of England. The documentation here is solid. The English patent rolls and close rolls of John's reign, edited by Thomas Duffus Hardy for the Record Commission in 1833 and 1835, contain repeated entries naming Eustachius Monachus, letters of safe conduct, grants of payment, orders to local officials to provision his ships. The historian Henry Cannon, in a foundational article in the English Historical Review for 1912, walked through these records line by line. They show a working English naval contractor. John gave him the Channel Islands as a forward base. In particular, Sark. Sark in 1205 was 3 miles long, ringed by 400-foot cliffs, almost trackless. The two halves of the island are joined by a narrow ridge called La Coupée with sheer drops on both sides. There is one practical landing on the east coast at the cleft of Crewe Harbor and a network of sea caves on the west called the Gullio Caves. The island was barely populated. From Sark you could intercept anything coming north out of Brittany, anything coming south from the Cottonton, and you could be on the English south coast in a day's sailing. Cliffs as a moat, caves as warehouse, tide as gatekeeper. It was a nearly perfect pirate fortress. His brothers came with him. The names that appear in the records are Manessier, Baudouin, and Guillaume Bousquet, with at least one nephew, all captains in his fleet. They were a family business. For 7 years, Eustace ran a state-licensed pirate operation against French shipping out of the Channel Islands. He raided the Boulonnais coast, sometimes against Renault personally. He took French merchant ships. He intercepted Norman wine convoys. The English pipe rolls record disbursements for galley upkeep and crew wages. The trouble was that he also took English shipping when it suited him. The close rolls preserve multiple orders from John for restitution to wronged English merchants whose cargoes Eustace had lifted. The Cinque Ports, the chartered medieval ports of the Kent and Sussex coast, complained loudly. He was robbing his own employer's commerce when that commerce passed too close to Sark. In 1212, the relationship broke. The cause was Renaud de Damertin. On the 8th of May, 1212, Renaud signed the Treaty of Lambeth with King John. He had defected from France. He was now an English pensioned ally, and within 2 years he would fight in the imperial coalition against Philip Augustus at the Battle of Bouvines. Eustace had been doing the King of England's naval work in part because that work was directed against the man who had made him an outlaw. Now that man was on the same payroll. The arrangement was over. Eustace walked across the Channel. By the end of 1212, he was operating for Philip Augustus of France. John responded by seizing his daughter as a hostage, confiscating the English lands held by his brothers, and putting a price on his head. For the next 4 years, he raided the English coast. Folkestone was burnt. Sandwich, Rye, and Winchelsea were attacked. The Cinque Ports, who had complained about him as an English captain, now hated him as a French one. He sailed under the lilies of France, paid by the same crown he had spent 7 years robbing. Then King John died. On the night of the 18th of October, 1216, John died at Newark. His 9-year-old son Henry was crowned at Gloucester 10 days later. William Marshal, the Earl of Pembroke, the most experienced soldier in the Angevin world, and now 69 years old, took office as regent. The country was already at war with itself. A faction of English barons, fed up with John, had invited Prince Louis of France, the eldest son of Philip Augustus, to take the English crown. Louis had landed at Stonor on the Isle of Thanet on the 21st of May, 1216, in a fleet organized and piloted by Eustace. By the spring of 1217, Louis held London and most of the southeast of England. He was, by any practical measure, King of England in everything but coronation. Then, on the 20th of May, 1217, William Marshal won the Battle of Lincoln. The French field army in England was broken. The Count of Perche, Louis's commander on land, was killed. Louis pulled back inside London and sent across the Channel for reinforcements. His wife, Blanche of Castile, the future regent of Louis IX, organized the relief fleet at Calais. Command of the fleet was given to Eustace. This brings us back to the morning of August 24th, 1217, and to what happened on the water off the Goodwin Sands. Here is what most retellings of the Battle of Sandwich miss. And here is why they miss it. The standard story is that Hubert de Burgh, the Justiciar of England, took the English Cinque Ports fleet out of Sandwich Harbor on the morning of August 24, faced a French fleet roughly 4 times his size, and defeated it through a combination of tall-sided cogs, English archery, and luck. That story is not wrong, it is incomplete. And what it leaves out is the most important thing about the battle. The French fleet that morning carried, by most chronicle accounts, 10 large ships and around 70 smaller transports, 80 hulls in total. The English fleet was much smaller. Modern reconstructions suggest 16 to 22 large cogs, plus smaller galleys. The English were outnumbered roughly 3-1 in ships. The French had the wind. Northeast, fresh on their port quarter, driving them past the Goodwin Sands toward the Thames estuary and London. When Hubert de Burgh led his ships out of Sandwich, he did not steer toward the French. He steered southeast, away, as if he were running for Calais. The French commanders, watching from their decks, drew the obvious conclusion. The English had seen the size of the fleet and were declining battle. They let the English ships pass. They did not pursue. They held their course for London. It was the wrong conclusion. Once Hubert de Burgh's fleet was past the French rear, his cogs came about. The wind that had been against them was now behind them. They had taken what later centuries of naval officers would call the weather gauge, the windward position, the position from which the commander, not his enemy, decides when to engage. The English bore down on the French rear from the northeast, sails full, archers in the high castles. The French, sailing forward and downwind, had to defend looking backwards over their stern. This is where the chemical weapon comes in. In the high castles of the English ships were clay pots. Inside the pots was a powder of finely ground quicklime, calcium oxide, the same caustic agent used by Crusader garrisons against besiegers and known to medieval Latin recipe books like the Mappae Clavicula. When it touches moisture, including the moisture of the human eye, it slakes violently into calcium hydroxide, a strong alkali, and burns severely. As the English ships came up on the French stern quarter, sailors threw the lime pots into the wind. The pots shattered against rigging and decks. The fine powder caught the northeast breeze and was carried in a dry, choking cloud into the faces of the French crews on the lower-lying transports beneath them. In Matthew Paris's account, writing at the Abbey of St. Albans in the 1240s and 1250s, the English ships had ready a great quantity of quicklime ground to a very fine powder, which was carried by the wind into the eyes of the French, so that they could no longer see to defend themselves. That is a 13th century English chronicler describing the deliberate deployment of a chemical agent at sea, 3 centuries before the first naval cannon and 5 centuries before the line of battle. His older source, Roger of Wendover, gives the same detail in shorter form. The Anonymous of Bethune, who served in the household of a Flemish lord in English service and is the closest source we have to an eyewitness layer, gives a vivid account of the battle, but emphasizes a different weapon. He describes English boarders cutting the French halyards with axes so that the great sails fell on top of the defenders, smothering arms and weapons. The Barnwell chronicler, the most reliable contemporary English narrative of the period, does not mention quicklime at all. So the lime detail rests primarily on Matthew Paris, writing 30 years later. It is plausible. Lime was a known weapon. The conditions were right, but it is not unanimous in the chronicle record, and an honest history says so. What is unanimous is the windward maneuver. Every chronicle agrees that the English took position before they engaged, and that the position decided the battle. 3 things were on display that morning that would define naval combat for the next 400 years. The deliberate sacrifice of an apparent advantage to take the wind. The willingness to fight before grappling, with weapons applied at range against a downwind enemy. And the choice of the moment of contact by the windward commander rather than the leeward one. The men who fought at Trafalgar in 1805 would have recognized every one of those principles. They would not necessarily have recognized the lime pots, but they would have recognized the geometry. Sandwich is the moment a fleet engagement in northern European waters stopped being a land battle conducted on water and started being something else, something tactical, something that turned on what the commander did before swords were drawn. Eustace, sitting on his overloaded flagship, was the leeward commander. What happened next has the rough shape that the chronicles agree on, even where they disagree on details. The English cogs ranged alongside the French transports. Grapnels went over with a thump of iron-biting wood. Axes went into the French halyards. The Anonymous of Bethune is the strongest source on this part. He describes the French sails coming down on top of the men trying to defend the decks, the canvas trapping arms and weapons, the boarders cutting through the smothered crews from above. The smaller French ships were taken first. Most surrendered. Robert de Courtenay, the field commander on board, and most of the knights with him were taken alive for ransom. They were valuable. A live count or knight in the 13th century was a financial asset. A dead one was just a body. The flagship was the last to be boarded. She was the great ship of the fleet, the largest hull, and she had been overloaded. Matthew Paris records that she was so heavily laden with the trebuchet for the siege of London, the war chests, the knights, and the supplies, that her freeboard, the height of her sides above the waterline, was almost gone. Waves were already washing across her deck. When the English boarders came over her sides, the fighting on deck was sharp and short. Eustace, by every account, did not lead it from the front. He went down into the bilge. The bilge of a 13th century great ship was the lowest interior space, below the decks, where the ballast stones sat in foul water. It was wet. It stank of vomit, salt, fish rot, and the cargo. It was the worst place on the ship, and therefore the place nobody would look first. The English found him. 2 sailors went down and dragged him up by the ballast stones. He stood on his own deck in front of the boarding party, salt water and ballast slime on his clothes. He offered 10,000 marks for his life. Matthew Paris records the figure. 10,000 marks was a vast sum. It was, by coincidence or by deliberate echo, the same sum that would shortly buy Prince Louis his retreat from England. The offer was refused. The chronicles disagree about who took his head off. Matthew Paris and Roger of Wendover leaned toward Richard Fitzjohn, a bastard son of King John who was serving with the English fleet that day. The Romance of Eustace, written within decades of his death, attributes the killing to Stephen Crabbe, said to have been Eustace's own former pupil, who had boarded the flagship in disguise to find his old master. Cannon, in the 1912 article, treats the Fitzjohn attribution as the better supported tradition. The Stephen Crabbe story has the shape of a literary ending and may be the romance's invention. What the chronicles all agree on is that Eustace was beheaded on the deck of his own flagship within minutes of being dragged from the bilge. Some accounts include a brief grim choice offered by his captors between being beheaded on the ship's rail or on the trebuchet that had been intended for the walls of London. There is no way to verify this. It has the smell of folk memory. His head was put on a pike. For the next several days the head of Eustace the monk was carried through the Cinque ports of England: Sandwich, Dover, Hythe, Romney, Hastings, Rye, Winchelsea. Then inland to Canterbury. Wendover and Matthew Paris both record this. The man who had burnt Folkestone 5 years earlier, who had robbed English merchants under license from John, and again without license under Philip, was now a trophy on a pole. His body was not given honorable burial. The sources are silent or contradictory. The most likely fate, given the circumstances, is that it was thrown overboard or buried in unconsecrated ground at Sandwich. There is no known tomb anywhere. The political consequence of the battle was complete. With his reinforcement fleet on the bottom of the Channel, with no money, no knights, no trebuchet, and no admiral, Prince Louis of France had no military path forward in England. His wife Blanche could not raise a second fleet quickly. The English Cinque ports controlled the Channel. On the 11th of September, 1217, Louis came to terms. The Treaty of Lambeth, sometimes called the Treaty of Kingston, was signed. Louis renounced his claim to the English throne. He received 10,000 marks. He went home to France. Henry III would reign for 56 years. England would not face another serious cross-channel invasion until 1588. Of Eustace's family, the record after Sandwich is fragmentary. At least one son, possibly named Eustace, appears in some 13th century French records under the name Eustace Fils Eustace Le Moyne. The line cannot be securely traced. His daughter, taken as a hostage by King John in 1212, disappears from the records. His brothers, several of whom captained ships in his fleet, were either killed at Sandwich or captured and ransomed. None of them is documented as continuing a piratical career afterwards. The family business closed with the family head. The romance about him was written within a generation, in Picard French, in the Boulonnais, or near it, by an anonymous author who knew the country and the names. 2,300 lines of octosyllabic verse surviving in a single manuscript in Paris. Some of what it tells you is true. Most of what it tells you is invented. The standard modern edition is by Dennis Conlon in 1972, and the standard English translation is by Glyn Burgess in 1997. They are the books to read if you want to meet the Eustace the medieval Boulonnais wanted to remember. A magician, a trickster, a shapeshifter, a man who had Toledo Latin and demonic helpers. The Eustace the chroniclers wrote down is a different man. A working naval contractor, paid by both kings of the Channel in turn, broken in the end by a regent's fleet that had taken the wind before he saw what was coming. Modern scholarship has not let go of him. Henry Cannon's 1912 article in the English Historical Review remains the foundational document. Sean McGlynn, in Blood Cries Afar, his 2011 study of the French invasion of England, has called Sandwich the most important sea battle in English history before the Spanish Armada. Susan Rose, in her Medieval Naval Warfare, treats the windward maneuver as the decisive tactical fact, and the lime as a plausible early naval use of a chemical agent. The naval historian Nicholas Roger, in The Safeguard of the Sea, accepts the maneuver, is cautious about the lime, and treats Sandwich as the classic medieval English example of taking the weather gauge. There is no statue of Eustace anywhere, not in Sandwich, not on Sark, not in Boulogne, not in the village of Samer where his old abbey of St. Wolmer stood. The 800th anniversary of the battle in 2017 produced reenactments and exhibits. No permanent memorial to him was put up. The man who taught medieval England how to take the wind has no grave. The abbey of St. Wolmer at Samer is mostly gone now. A few stones in the village. The forest of Hardlotte is still there, smaller, cut through by a road. Boulogne has a comital castle still standing on the hill in the Haute Ville, behind walls Eustace would have known. None of it carries his name. Sark has La Coupée, 400-foot cliffs, and the Gouliot Caves on the west coast, where local tradition, since the Victorian guidebook era, has placed his hideouts. There is no plaque. The island shows you cliffs and weather and tells you nothing. The Goodwin Sands are still there, 10 miles long off the Kent coast. The great ship Swallower. Mariners still avoid them. The water above them is a known place where things go down and are not found again. Somewhere in that water, or in unconsecrated ground at Sandwich, is the body of a Benedictine monk who became the most valuable mariner of his generation, paid in turn by the kings of England and France, and brought down by a tactic he could not have seen coming. If you made it this far, a like on this one helps more than the algorithm admits. Thanks for sitting with me through it. The sea keeps its own ledger. Not everything makes it in.